Welcome to Tales by Tochi. These stories are real, unique and exceptional because they are from personal experiences around the African culture. Don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me, and also you will be able to enjoy and learn from these amazing stories. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Jason Williams was the kind of man who turned heads the moment he walked into a room. With chiseled features, designer suits that clung to his frame like a second skin, and a cocky swagger that reeked of inherited wealth, he was the living definition of a spoiled heir. He wasn't just the only son of Richard Williams, a self-made billionaire and CEO of a multinational corporation. He was the heir apparent to a fortune built over decades of sweat and sacrifice. But none of that mattered to Jason. From luxury nightclubs to exotic beaches, his only concern was pleasure. And his favorite source of pleasure? Curvy, big-breasted women who dripped sex appeal and chased after his last name like it was gold. Each night was a party and each morning a hangover. His life was a carousel of champagne, women, fast cars and reckless abandon. Responsibility wasn't in his vocabulary. Why bother when the world bowed at his feet? His father, Richard, watched his son spiral with a hardened heart. In his eyes, Jason was a disappointment, an immature manchild unworthy of the empire he'd worked so hard to build. They had their arguments, often explosive, and always ending in Jason laughing off his father's warnings. "I'm young, rich, and untouchable," he once said after crashing a brand new Ferrari during a drunken joyride. That arrogance was a shield, protecting Jason from the truth. Deep down he was terrified of not living up to his father's legacy. But instead of facing that fear, he drowned it in women and whiskey. He surrounded himself with yes men and Instagram models, people who worshipped his wealth and never questioned his choices. Behind the glamour was a void he couldn't name, a growing emptiness that no luxury could fill. Everyone warned him. His mother, before she passed away, had begged him to slow down. His father's executives shook their heads in board meetings, whispering about his antics and wondering what the future held for the company. But Jason didn't care. Not when he was the prince of the city, with paparazzi flashing cameras and tabloids writing about his latest affair. He was living what others could only dream of, convinced that nothing could ever touch him. He believed he had time to mature later after all the fun was over. But what he didn't know was that his recklessness was about to cost him more than money. It would cost him his dignity, his health, and everything he thought made him who he was. The night started like any other, with a red carpet, velvet ropes and champagne waterfalls. Jason stepped out of a black Rolls-Royce, surrounded by a crew of men in designer clothes and women who looked like they belonged in music videos. Tonight's venue was an elite club called Eclipse, known for its secrecy and its dangerous allure. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and smoke, bodies grinding to pulsing music under hypnotic lights. Jason moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting shots, kisses and praise. And then he saw her. A woman unlike any he'd seen before, dark-skinned, dangerously curvy, with a hypnotic sway to her hips and eyes that pierced right through his soul. She didn't approach him, she waited for him to come to her. That intrigued him. He loved to chase. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. She whispered her name, Nina, and pulled him into the VIP lounge like they were the only two people in the world. Jason was used to women throwing themselves at him, but this one was different. She didn't fawn over his wealth or beg for selfies. Instead, she studied him like a mystery she was trying to solve. They drank, danced, and disappeared into the private suite above the club, where the night melted into a blur of lust, sweat, and indulgence. By morning, Nina was gone, leaving behind nothing but a lipstick-stained note that read, "Be careful what you chase. Some pleasures are cursed." Jason laughed it off, tossing the note aside and calling his chauffeur to bring him breakfast and a new watch. He'd lost his during the night. In the weeks that followed, Jason went back to his usual routine, traveling, partying, and picking up women without names. But something felt different. He started experiencing fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, night sweats that drenched his sheets, and bruises that wouldn't heal. At first he blamed it on stress and drinking. Then came the persistent fever and swollen glands. He visited a private clinic, more annoyed than concerned. The doctor ran tests and called him back a week later. The look on her face when she walked in said it all. "Jason," she began, her voice cautious, "your HIV test came back positive." Time froze. His ears rang. The room felt like it was spinning. He laughed at first, waiting for her to say she was joking. But she wasn't. That night with Nina, her eyes, her mysterious aura, her warning, flashed before him like a cruel joke from the universe. Jason stared at the mirror for hours after the diagnosis, unable to recognize the reflection. The confident, cocky air was gone, replaced by a ghost of himself, pale, shaking, and terrified. The doctor's words kept playing in his mind, "It's not a death sentence if managed properly." But all Jason heard was "infected." He didn't tell anyone. He thought if he ignored it long enough it would go away. But it didn't. He tried to continue life as usual, showing up to parties, wearing designer shades to hide the fear in his eyes. But his energy was fading fast and the rumors started swirling. One of his former flings posted a cryptic status on social media, "We should really get tested. Not all riches protect you." That post went viral. Within hours, the gossip blogs were alive with speculation about Jason's health. By the time he told his father, it was too late. Richard Williams had already received a private report from a corporate investigator he'd hired to track Jason's activities. The older man was livid, not just at the diagnosis, but at the public embarrassment it had brought to the family name. In front of board members and family friends, Richard denounced his only son, calling him a disgrace and a liability. "You've shamed this family for the last time," he roared. "You're not welcome in this house anymore. You'll get no inheritance, no protection, nothing. You wanted to live like a stray dog? Then go live like one." Jason tried to plead, his voice cracking, but his father turned his back. That night, security escorted Jason out of the mansion he'd called home his entire life, leaving him with nothing but a suitcase and the clothes on his back. The fall from grace was brutal. Jason tried calling his friends, none of them picked up. The women who once chased after his money now mocked him online. His credit cards were frozen. He slept in his car for 2 nights until it was repossessed. Eventually he found himself curled up on a bench outside a rundown clinic, hungry, cold, and utterly alone. The same media that once celebrated his parties now ridiculed his downfall. The prince of the city had become a pariah. For the first time in his life, Jason felt the sting of true loneliness. And in that moment of despair, he realized the truth. The lifestyle he once glorified had betrayed him, and everything he had taken for granted was gone. All he had left was the virus in his blood and a heart full of regrets. Jason stood outside the Williams estate for what felt like hours, the weight of rejection pressing down on him like an avalanche. The once adoring staff now looked at him with disdain or pity. The gate that had always opened at his arrival remained firmly closed. He knocked, pleaded, even cried, but no one answered. He wasn't Jason the heir anymore, he was just Jason the disgrace. With no money except the few Naira notes in his pocket and no one to call, he wandered the streets in shock. The silence from his father stung more than the public humiliation. It wasn't just about being cut off from the wealth, it was the way his father had stripped him of his identity, his place in the world, and left him exposed to ridicule. When Jason passed a newspaper stand and saw his face on the cover with the headline, "CEO's son diagnosed with HIV, family in disgrace," he knew the damage was permanent. The world that once celebrated him had now turned him into a public cautionary tale. Desperate, Jason tried checking into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, but even there the receptionist recognized him and hesitated. "Are you that guy from the news?" she asked, half curious, half scared. Jason nodded and begged her not to turn him away. She reluctantly gave him a room with peeling wallpaper, a creaky bed, and a flickering bulb. It was a far cry from the 5-star suites he used to stay in, but it was shelter. For days he barely left the room. His phone rang occasionally, journalists pretending to be friends, old flings trying to confirm the rumors, but never his father. The silence from his family was the loudest noise in his life. The humiliation, the loneliness, the fear of death, all of it overwhelmed him. One night, he stared at a handful of pills on the table, contemplating ending it all. But something inside him, a whisper, maybe his mother's memory, told him to hold on just one more day. That next day brought the final blow. Jason returned to his motel after trying unsuccessfully to beg an old friend for help, only to find his belongings tossed outside. "No payments, no stay," the manager said. "You're bad for business." His last physical possession, a suitcase filled with designer clothes that now felt like costumes, was stolen while he searched for food. Jason wandered aimlessly, broke and sick, ignored by people he once sneered at. He finally collapsed outside a community clinic, unconscious from exhaustion and dehydration. The world that had once applauded him now watched his downfall with cruel amusement. But as he lay unconscious on the cold pavement, barely breathing, someone bent over him. Someone who didn't care who he had been or what mistakes he had made. Her name was Amaka, and she would become the light in his darkest hour. Amaka's apartment was barely more than a single room with a tiny kitchenette, a rickety ceiling fan, and an old foam mattress on the floor, but it felt like a palace to Jason. He awoke to the smell of boiling herbs and the sound of soft humming. His head throbbed, his limbs ached, but the overwhelming feeling was one of safety. Amaka stood by the stove, her dark skin glowing with sweat as she stirred a pot. She turned with a warm smile, her face beautiful not in the way models were, but in the way honesty and kindness were. "You're awake," she said softly. "You've been sleeping for almost 2 days." Jason tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "Where am I?" he croaked. "In my home," she replied. "You were lying half dead outside the clinic. I couldn't leave you there." Jason stared at her, confused. Why would a stranger help him when the whole world had turned its back? Over the next few days, Amaka nursed him with care and discipline. She bathed his wounds, fed him from her meager supplies, and gave him a place to rest. Jason tried to protest at first, embarrassed by his helplessness, but Amaka shut him down with a firm look. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Her words pierced through the walls Jason had built around his heart. In his old life, women fawned over him for his money. But Amaka didn't know who he was, or if she did, she didn't care. She treated him like a human being, not a fallen celebrity. Slowly, Jason began to heal. The fevers subsided, the aches became manageable, and he started to regain strength. And for the first time in months he laughed. A soft, broken laugh, but genuine. One evening, as they sat on the floor eating boiled yam and sauce, Jason finally opened up. He told her everything, about the wild life, the diagnosis, the humiliation, and how his father had thrown him out. Amaka listened without judgment, her eyes soft with empathy. "You were broken," she said when he finished. "But broken things can be mended." Her words shook him. For so long, Jason believed his worth was tied to his wealth and status. But here, in this small apartment with a woman who had nothing yet gave everything, he was starting to discover another kind of value. One rooted in resilience, humility, and love. That night he couldn't sleep. Not because of discomfort but because something new stirred in him. A desire to rebuild. To become someone worthy, not just of Amaka but of a second chance. Jason woke up the next morning with a new resolve. His body still ached, and the occasional bouts of fatigue reminded him that HIV was a shadow he would always live with. But he no longer felt defeated. Instead, he began helping Amaka with her daily routines. Carrying water, assisting at her market stall, learning how to sew minor fabric tiers. At first, his efforts were clumsy and he often laughed at himself. The great Jason Williams learning how to fold wrappers, he would joke. Amaka always smiled. But she didn't mock him. She encouraged him. "Every king starts as a servant," she said once, handing him a tray of fried plantain to sell. "There is dignity in every kind of work." Those words sank deep into Jason's soul. For the first time he found joy in being useful. He had never imagined himself as a man who could survive on the streets, yet here he was, adapting, learning, and slowly rebuilding. As the weeks passed, Jason began drawing on the business instincts he had inherited from his father, instincts he had once buried under parties and arrogance. He saw ways to improve Amaka's small hustle, suggested better packaging, designed a flyer, and even convinced her to expand her food sales to nearby schools and bus stops. "You think like a businessman," she told him one afternoon. Jason looked at her, eyes wide. "I guess I finally want to become one," he replied. It was a turning point. He wasn't trying to regain his former lifestyle. He was trying to earn a life that had real meaning. Amaka continued to support him without expecting anything in return. She stood by him not as a savior but as a partner. The intimacy between them grew, not physical at first but emotional. She knew his scars and he knew her heart. One night, after a long day of selling at the bus park, Jason watched her sleep beside him on the floor. The fan above them clicked rhythmically, and the sound of distant traffic drifted through the window. He studied her face, the small freckles on her nose, the calm in her breathing. She had seen him at his worst and had never once turned away. It terrified him. And it filled him with gratitude. He leaned close and whispered, "You saved me, Amaka. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." She stirred but didn't wake. Jason lay back and stared at the ceiling, heart full. He didn't know what the future held. He had no guarantee of success or forgiveness from his father. But he had something he'd never truly had before, purpose. And the woman beside him? She was more than a helper, she was his miracle. Jason slowly transformed from a man haunted by shame into someone who could breathe again. Every morning began with gratitude, not groaning. He swept the front of Amaka's home, fixed broken pots and shelves, and ran errands around the neighborhood. People in the compound who once stared at him with suspicion started nodding in greeting. Amaka's neighbors began calling him Uncle Jay, a name that made him smile more than he expected. Though he was far from where he used to be, the days were peaceful, and in their simplicity, they taught him the value of things money could never buy. His body still bore the consequences of his past, but his heart was healing. Every time Amaka handed him a bowl of rice or laid out his blanket at night, he felt a warmth richer than any five-star service. But living with Amaka wasn't always easy. Jason battled guilt for being a burden, for needing her kindness, and for not being able to repay her yet. Sometimes he snapped, accusing her of pitying him. But Amaka never fought back in anger. "Stop punishing yourself for what life already punished you for," she would say, holding his hand until he calmed. There were days he stayed quiet, lost in thought, watching her mend clothes by candlelight. She didn't wear makeup, didn't chase fame, but she had an elegance about her that commanded his respect. When he complimented her for the first time, awkwardly telling her she looked peaceful, she laughed and said, "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." And in that laughter, Jason heard music he hadn't known he'd missed. One rainy night, the power went out and they sat together on the floor, sharing roasted corn. The conversation drifted from trivial jokes to painful memories. Amaka told him how she'd lost her parents in a car crash at 16 and raised her younger siblings until they were grown enough to fend for themselves. "Life didn't give me luxury," she said. "It gave me survival. But I'm not bitter. I'm grateful." Her story humbled Jason deeply. He realized that Amaka hadn't saved him by offering him food or shelter. She'd saved him by showing him what resilience looked like. That night, as she dozed off against his shoulder, Jason made a silent vow. He would find a way to build something new, not just for himself but for her. He would no longer be the man who wasted opportunities. He would become the man who created them. The following week, Jason approached Amaka with a small idea, starting a mobile phone repair service in their neighborhood. "I used to mess around with tech gadgets when I was younger," he said. "I can fix basic issues, battery replacements, screen repairs, charging ports. It's a start." Amaka looked at him, proud but cautious. "You sure you're ready?" she asked. Jason nodded. "I may not be who I was, but I can build something from scratch." With Amaka's encouragement, he went to a second-hand market and bought a cheap repair kit with the little savings they had. She even used part of her food stall profit to get him a wooden table for the front yard. They painted a cardboard sign together, "J-Fix, phone repair services, affordable and reliable." The first few days were quiet, with only a handful of curious passers-by. But Jason stayed patient. As days turned to weeks, his reputation began to grow. One customer turned into 3, then 10. Word spread that quiet guy with the gentle voice and big hands could fix almost any phone. Jason found satisfaction in the work, unscrewing phone backs, soldering connections, diagnosing issues. His hands, once used to grabbing champagne glasses and luxury steering wheels, now gripped tiny screwdrivers and wires. And it felt right. For the first time in his life, he wasn't taking, he was giving, helping, creating solutions. Every time a phone lit up in a customer's hand, their joy became his reward. And every time a customer returned, Jason's confidence grew. He stopped hiding his HIV status too, speaking openly about the importance of testing and treatment. "It's not the end," he'd say. "It's a wake-up call." Amaka remained his rock. She kept his books, helped him organize receipts, and even handled difficult customers with her calm grace. Their bond deepened. They had inside jokes, favorite songs, and a shared rhythm. Yet, Jason held back emotionally, unsure if he deserved someone like her. One evening, as they packed up for the night, he said quietly, "I think I'm falling for you." Amaka didn't respond immediately. She folded the tablecloth and looked at him. "Jason," she whispered, "I know. I've seen it in your eyes. But we're still healing, both of us." That night, under the stars, he didn't push. He simply sat beside her in silence, their shoulders touching, knowing that love, like healing, took time. And Jason was learning to wait, for once, with patience. Jason's business grew faster than he expected. Within 2 months, he had customers coming from neighboring streets. His work was consistent, honest, and affordable, which made him stand out. Amaka suggested adding a signpost at the street junction, and it doubled his visibility. With his first real profits, he paid off Amaka's debts at the market and bought her a new stove for cooking. She cried when he presented it to her, not because of the stove, but because of what it represented. "You're not just surviving, Jason," she said, hugging him tightly. "You're living. You're leading." Jason began training a young boy named Sadiq from the neighborhood, teaching him the basics of phone repairs. "You don't need to be rich to teach," he told the boy. You just need to be willing to learn. The act of giving back filled a void that luxury had never been able to touch. As Jason's life settled into a new rhythm, he still thought about his father. Sometimes with anger, sometimes with longing. There were moments when he drafted messages to Richard, trying to bridge the silence. But he always deleted them. His father's rejection still left a scar, but Jason didn't let it define him anymore. He poured his energy into community service, partnering with a local clinic to raise awareness about HIV and its treatment. People who once whispered about his past now came to him for advice, for jobs, for hope. Jason had gone from being a fallen heir to a pillar in his community. Every challenge he faced made him stronger, and every act of kindness from Amaka reminded him that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a choice made daily. One sunny afternoon, as he stood outside his shop, watching Sadiq assist a customer, Amaka walked up holding a small white envelope. "What's this?" Jason asked. She handed it to him with a sly smile. Inside was a positive pregnancy test. His heart stopped. I thought it wasn't possible," he stammered. Amaka laughed gently. "We were careful, but miracles happen, Jason." Tears welled in his eyes as he dropped to his knees, holding her hand. He had lost so much, his status, his family, his health. But in that moment, looking up at the woman who had rescued him and now carried his child, Jason knew he had gained something infinitely greater. A second chance. A family. A future worth fighting for. The news of Amaka's pregnancy brought with it a whirlwind of emotions for Jason. Joy was his first reaction, raw, overwhelming, and pure. But almost immediately after came fear. He knew his HIV status didn't necessarily mean the baby would be infected, especially since he had been consistent with his treatment. Still, the idea that a part of his past could hurt the innocent life growing inside Amaka made him anxious. He spent hours reading articles, visiting clinics, and asking questions at support groups. Amaka, ever calm and steady, reassured him that they would face everything together. "Our love didn't begin in ideal conditions," she told him one night, "but it's real. That's what matters." Her strength astounded him, and each passing day made him love her more deeply, more intentionally. They visited the clinic together for prenatal care, and the doctors confirmed that with Amaka's negative status and Jason's adherence to treatment, the baby had an excellent chance of being born HIV-free. The relief Jason felt was indescribable. He began to work harder than ever, taking on more clients, saving every naira, and even investing in better equipment for his shop. He wanted to give his child the kind of life he never appreciated growing up. A life not built on luxury but on love, dignity, and purpose. He also started attending relationship counseling and parenting classes. "I never had a good example of how to be a father," he admitted once. "But I want to be one." Amaka often watched him with a smile, proud of the man he was becoming. As Amaka's belly grew, so did their bond. One evening, Jason got down on one knee in the living room of their humble home, holding a simple silver ring he'd saved up for. "I can't promise riches," he said, voice shaking, "but I can promise love, protection, and a lifetime of gratitude. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled from Amaka's eyes as she nodded, whispering yes over and over again. They held each other for a long time, not needing witnesses or grand gestures. Their love had already been tested by storms and had withstood them all. The wedding was a quiet one, just a small gathering at a local church with neighbors who had become like family. No photographers, no designer gowns, no media headlines. Just two souls committing to walk through life side by side. And in that moment, Jason felt something he'd never truly felt before: peace. The day Jason held his son for the first time was the moment his world shifted permanently. The baby, wrapped in a soft blue cloth, blinked up at him with curious eyes. Jason wept openly, overcome by emotions he never knew lived inside him. The doctor smiled and confirmed the best news they could have hoped for. The baby was HIV negative. Jason held Amaka's hand tightly, whispering thank you 1,000 times through his tears. "You gave me everything," he said, kissing her forehead. They named the boy Nathaniel, meaning gift of God, because that's exactly what he was, a miracle born out of pain, faith, and unconditional love. Jason didn't sleep that night, too busy watching his son breathe, memorizing his every movement, his every sound. Becoming a father changed Jason more than anything else ever had. Every decision he made now had weight. He stopped taking risks with his health, never missed a clinic appointment, and began saving for Nathaniel's future. He created a separate fund for the boy and even sketched out plans to expand his repair business into a full electronics and tech hub. Amaka encouraged him every step of the way, and together they turned their small house into a haven of love and dreams. Even when money was tight and nights were long, Jason never complained. I once had everything and felt empty, he told Amaka. Now I have just enough and I've never felt fuller. He would often hold Nathaniel in his arms and whisper, I'll never let you feel the pain I felt. You'll know love, son. Real love. As Nathaniel grew, so did Jason's business. Customers from across the city came to J-Fix, and with Amaka's help, they opened a second kiosk closer to the bus terminal. Jason trained young boys who had once lived on the streets like he did, giving them skills and dignity. The community started recognizing his efforts, and local leaders began inviting him to speak at schools and youth programs. One day, a news crew showed up, interested in documenting his journey from disgraced heir to grassroots hero. At first, Jason refused. I don't want attention, he told Amaka. But maybe my story can stop someone from making the same mistakes. The segment aired and the feedback was overwhelming. People reached out to thank him, others asked for guidance, and many simply called to say they believed in him. And though Jason smiled at their words, the only approval he still longed for was from the man who had once cast him aside, his father. The interview on national television brought Jason's past roaring back into the spotlight, but this time, it wasn't laced with scandal, it was soaked in redemption. He spoke from his heart, not to justify his past, but to reveal the lessons hidden in it. He spoke of privilege, of pain, of the disease that nearly ended him and the love that saved him. The clip went viral. Social media, which once dragged him, now praised his courage. But among the flood of messages and phone calls, one voice remained silent, Richard Williams. Jason watched the news every night, half hoping to see his father's face, to hear his voice, even if it was just a denial or condemnation. But there was nothing. His father's silence was a boulder on his chest that wouldn't lift, no matter how much success he earned. One afternoon, Jason drafted a letter, not an email or a text, but a handwritten letter like the kind he used to send to his mother. In it, he poured out everything, his regrets, his gratitude, his new life. He included pictures of Amaka and Nathaniel, telling Richard, "You may never forgive me, but I hope you'll consider being part of your grandson's life. He deserves to know where he comes from, even if I've been cut off from it." He sent it with no expectations, only hope. Days turned into weeks. There was no reply. Jason told himself to let go, to move on, but late at night, he'd sometimes walk to the edge of the street and just stare in the direction of the city's high-rise skyline, wondering if his father had read the letter, if he'd even opened it. Then one rainy morning, Jason got a call from a number he didn't recognize. A deep voice spoke, "Mr. Jason Williams? This is Mr. Richard's assistant. He asked me to tell you, he received the letter." Jason's heart leapt. Did he say anything else? There was a pause. "He said he's not ready to see you. But he wants to see the boy." Jason stood frozen, phone clutched in his hand as tears filled his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a door, cracked open however slightly. That night, he held Nathaniel longer than usual, feeling both joy and ache in equal measure. "You broke through," he whispered into his son's tiny ear. "You did what I couldn't. You gave us a way back." Jason had no idea how far-reaching his interview would become. In a matter of days, media outlets across the country picked up his story, dubbing him the heir who rebuilt from ashes. Newspapers that once scorned him now splashed his photo on their covers again, but this time the headlines read, "From HIV to Hope, a son's rise from ruin." Radio shows discussed his resilience. TV anchors quoted his words on second chances. And NGOs reached out, asking him to speak at youth outreach programs and to collaborate on campaigns about HIV awareness and self-reinvention. For Jason it was surreal. The same world that watched him fall now lifted him up, not for his money or fame, but for his honesty and transformation. Yet, amid all the admiration, he remained grounded. He remembered the cold nights, the bitter rejection, and the hands of a woman who chose to love him when he was most unlovable. With newfound visibility came opportunity. A group of young tech entrepreneurs invited Jason to a networking summit, and he shared his journey with tears in his eyes. By the end of his talk, investors who had once dismissed him now stood in applause. A few offered financial backing to help scale J-Fix into a registered mobile tech service brand. Jason accepted cautiously, choosing his partners wisely. Amaka helped with contracts and planning, bringing her street-smart instincts into the business. They rented a small office space and hired 2 full-time staff members, including Sadiq, who had now become like a younger brother to Jason. The business expanded into computer and tablet repairs, offering internships to troubled youths in the community. Jason wasn't just rebuilding himself, he was building a legacy. But success did little to fill the space left by his father's silence. Even though Richard had asked to see Nathaniel, he still refused to speak directly to Jason. When Jason sent another letter offering a family visit, the response came again from the assistant. Mr. Richard is not ready to have that conversation. That sentence replayed in Jason's mind constantly. How could a father hold on to so much bitterness even now? I don't need his money, his name, or even his apology anymore, Jason told Amaka one night. But I need closure. Not for me, for Nathaniel. I need him to see his grandfather as more than a myth. Amaka wrapped her arms around him gently and said, "Then keep being the man you are. The day will come when truth speaks louder than pride." Months passed and JFix continued to grow. Jason was invited to a televised national entrepreneurship panel where he sat beside CEOs and ministers. Watching himself seated among giants made him emotional. He never bragged about the things he achieved, he let his work speak. Still, his eyes always drifted toward the front row, looking for a man who never showed up. When the moderator mentioned Jason's father during the Q&A, asking whether reconciliation was in sight, Jason smiled faintly and said, "I still believe in miracles. But some wounds don't heal overnight. And some fathers need time to see the son they never looked for." That quote trended for days, stirring debates and opinions. Many praised Jason for his grace, while others called on Richard Williams to forgive his son and reconcile. Still, the silence from Richard remained. It was Nathaniel's first birthday that stirred a shift. Amaka planned a small celebration at a local children's park: balloons, homemade cake, and a clown borrowed from a friend. Jason invited everyone who had supported them. Sadiq brought soda. The women from the market brought jollof rice and suya. The entire neighborhood turned out. As Jason helped his son cut the cake, a sleek black SUV parked quietly across the road. A tall man stepped out, dressed in a gray suit, his salt and pepper hair catching the sunlight. Jason froze. Amaka looked up from the food table and gasped softly. Richard Williams stood there, expression unreadable, holding a small gift bag. He didn't approach Jason. Instead, he walked straight toward Nathaniel, knelt slowly and said softly, "Happy birthday, young man." Everyone went silent. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He watched his father, stoic, composed but clearly moved, as he handed the baby a wooden toy train. Nathaniel babbled and grabbed it, laughing. Richard's lips quivered, but he said nothing else. Then, without glancing at Jason, he stood and turned to leave. Jason's voice cracked as he called out, "You're welcome to stay." Richard paused but kept walking. For a moment, Jason felt the sting of rejection again. But then Amaka came to his side, placing her hand on his shoulder. "He came," she said. "He touched his grandson. That's more than we had before." Jason nodded, his chest heavy but proud. Maybe his father couldn't yet embrace him, but at least he had reached out, even if just for the boy. Jason found himself thinking more and more about the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. Not the kind built on money or a famous surname, but one forged in change, compassion, and resilience. One night, he took a walk with Amaka through the old neighborhood, the place where he had first tasted humility, where his pride had shattered, and where love had saved him. They passed the street corner where he had once collapsed, bloody and forgotten. Now that very corner had a new sign, JFix Foundation, empowering through repair. With the help of donors and grants, Jason had turned part of his profits into a charity initiative that offered tech training, counseling, and healthcare access to youths living with HIV or affected by it. "We won't just fix phones," he told the board. "We'll fix lives." The foundation became a beacon in the city. Jason was invited to join government task forces on youth rehabilitation, and international agencies sought to partner with him. But still, every decision was run by Amaka. "You're my compass," he told her once, and she smiled, kissing his forehead. Their love was no longer about passion or rescue, it was partnership. A union born from ashes but strengthened by fire. Nathaniel, now walking and speaking his first words, became the heartbeat of their home. He had Richard's eyes and Jason's smile, a daily reminder that from broken roots, beautiful things could still bloom. Jason didn't shy away from telling his son the truth. "One day," he whispered while rocking him to sleep, "you'll hear things about who I was. But know this, I fought to become better, for you." Then came the letter, neatly typed, formal and signed in pen. From Richard. It read, "I may never be able to say what you need to hear. But I see the man you've become. I see the father you are. Thank you for raising him with integrity. I hope you'll allow me to be part of his life." Jason stared at the letter for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. But it was acknowledgement. And that meant something. He folded it gently and placed it in a drawer. Later that night, as he stood at the window watching Nathaniel play with Amaka in the yard, he smiled. "This is what legacy looks like," he whispered. "Not buildings, not bank accounts, but love that lasts longer than mistakes." Though Richard Williams had not yet uttered the words Jason longed to hear, his presence became increasingly frequent in the boy's life. Every other weekend, a luxury car would appear at the edge of the compound, and Nathaniel, now talking and full of energy, would run toward it with the unfiltered excitement only children possess. Richard never stayed long. He'd bring gifts, books, building blocks, a mini piano. He'd speak gently only to the child, and then retreat as silently as he came. He still wouldn't meet Jason's eyes, still avoided speaking more than necessary. But Jason, standing quietly behind the curtains, noticed how his father lingered after each visit. Sometimes he even caught Richard watching Amaka from a distance, perhaps realizing, though silently, the grace that had held his son together. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a thread, thin but real, connecting them through blood. Amaka encouraged the interaction even when Jason's pride wavered. "Let Nathaniel have this," she'd say. "Whatever pain you and your father share, don't pass it to him. Let love start fresh." Jason agreed, though it wasn't easy. He wanted answers, closure, and even justice. But he didn't want his son to grow up bitter or burdened with battles he didn't choose. So he played along. He dressed Nathaniel in his best on visiting days, coached him to be respectful, and smiled through the ache of standing unseen beside the very man whose name once gave him everything. Jason journaled his emotions often, processing them privately, pouring his confusion and hope into letters he never sent. The wound was still there, but the presence of his son had given it a new kind of healing, one that came not from confrontation but from acceptance. It was during one of these visits that Richard surprised them. For the first time he entered their home, stepping past the doorway with cautious eyes. Jason watched him walk through the space Amaka had carefully nurtured, photos on the walls, neat curtains, toys in baskets, and books on the shelf. Richard said little. He picked up a drawing of a house Nathaniel had made and stared at it for a long time. Then, placing it down, he turned to Amaka and said, "You've made him a home." "Thank you." It was the first time Richard had acknowledged her directly. Amaka nodded, offering a quiet, polite smile. Jason stood frozen, stunned by the moment. Richard didn't say more. He placed his hand briefly on Jason's shoulder, barely a touch, and walked out. But that light contact felt heavier than 1,000 words. It was the closest Jason had come to hearing, "I see you now, son." Jason sat in his room that evening, holding his father's brief shoulder touch in his heart like a fragile ember. He didn't know if it was meant as a sign of peace, guilt, or simply habit, but it meant something. He looked down at his son, sleeping soundly with his small arms spread wide, and realized that healing often came in pieces, not waves. He couldn't force Richard to speak or apologize, but he could control what he did with his own pain. Jason picked up one of the many letters he'd written but never sent, then tore it in half. It was time to stop waiting for the past to fix itself. The present, his wife, his son, their life, deserved his full presence. So he made a new decision. He would love his father, even from a distance. And if the man never said a word more, that would be okay. Some people never unlearn their pride, but their children could choose something better. The next morning, Jason drafted a different kind of letter, this time to his son. He wrote about the journey from arrogance to humility, from abandonment to belonging. He described the cold nights, the hunger, the fear, but also the kindness that saved him. He told Nathaniel about Amaka's faith, about the pain of being disowned, and about the slow beauty of rebuilding from nothing. He ended it with, "If ever life breaks you, my son, know this, you are more than your scars. You are my reason for becoming a better man." He sealed the letter and placed it in a box labeled, "For Nathaniel, when you're ready." That small act felt like a full-circle moment. Jason couldn't change how his father raised him, but he could leave behind a blueprint of love for his own child. Later that week, Jason was invited to speak at an international conference in Abuja. He hesitated at first, worried about being away from Amaka and Nathaniel, but she insisted. "Your story gives people hope," she said, adjusting his tie before he left. "Go remind someone that broken doesn't mean finished." At the event, Jason stood before a hall filled with diplomats, entrepreneurs, and young dreamers. He shared not just his story but his truth. "I was rich and I fell. But it wasn't the fall that changed me, it was the hand that picked me up. That hand didn't belong to a billionaire. It belonged to a poor girl with a rich heart. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Among them sat a gray-haired man in the shadows. Jason didn't see him, but he felt it, a presence, a softness in the air. Richard had come. Not to speak. Just to listen. 2 days after returning from Abuja, Jason opened his shop to find Richard sitting quietly in the waiting area. No entourage, no fancy suit, just a man holding a folded newspaper with his son's face on the front page. "You came?" Jason said softly. Richard looked up, his eyes tired but not cold. "I heard you speak," he replied. "I never realized how much you had to say." There was a silence between them, thick but not hostile. Jason walked over, sat opposite him, and waited. For once he didn't rush to fill the air. It was Richard who spoke again. "I was wrong. Not for being angry, you gave me reason. But for letting that anger make me blind." Jason swallowed hard. It wasn't an apology. But it was something. "I wanted to raise a perfect heir," Richard continued, "but I forgot to raise a son. I thought success meant control. But now, I see it means letting people become who they're meant to be, even if they take the long road." His voice trembled. Jason felt tears sting his eyes but kept them at bay. "You never failed me, Dad," he said. "You just stopped looking at me when I needed you most. But I forgive you. I've been ready for a long time." For the first time in years, Richard leaned forward and embraced his son. It wasn't tight. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. Two men, one broken by pride, the other by pain, finding a middle ground in the shadow of a child who reminded them both what love really meant. Later that evening, they sat together in Jason's modest home. Amaka brought tea and Nathaniel climbed onto Richard's lap without fear. The old man chuckled, a sound Jason hadn't heard since childhood. They talked, not about the past, not yet, but about the present, about the business, about fatherhood, about change. Before leaving, Richard stood at the door and looked Jason in the eye. "I still don't know how to say sorry," he admitted. "But I'm proud of you. I want you to know that." Jason nodded, voice choked. "That's enough. Thank you." As Richard walked away, Jason held Amaka's hand and whispered, "I never thought I'd get this day." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You earned it," she said. "Every step of the way." In the weeks following their long overdue reconciliation, Jason and Richard settled into a fragile but growing rhythm. They didn't speak about the years lost, nor did they revisit the harsh words once exchanged. There was no need. Their conversations now were laced with new beginnings, discussions about Nathaniel's schooling, updates on the J-Fix Foundation, and quiet walks through the community that had once watched Jason fall. The past was not erased, but it no longer dominated their every interaction. For Jason, this fragile truce with his father was enough. He wasn't searching for grand apologies or tearful speeches. What he had was presence. His father was present in his grandson's life, present at family dinners, present in ways he hadn't been for years. That silent, steady presence was more healing than any confession. Amaka, ever intuitive, knew exactly how to hold that space. Never pressing, never demanding. She welcomed Richard into their home with warmth and simplicity, just as she had welcomed Jason when he had nothing. One evening, while Jason was at the shop, Richard helped Nathaniel build a wooden block tower in the living room. When it collapsed, Nathaniel burst into laughter, and Richard laughed with him, genuinely and without restraint. Amaka stood at the doorway watching them. It was in that moment that she saw not a stern CEO or a cold-hearted father, but a man who had missed too much and was trying in his own way to make up for it. She approached him and gently said, "You've done more in the last few weeks than in years." "Thank you." Richard looked at her, voice quiet. "You saved him, Amaka. When I didn't." Meanwhile, J-Fix was no longer just a business. It had become a movement. With branches in 3 cities and partnerships with youth rehabilitation centers, Jason's story became part of the foundation's branding. Billboards carried his message, "Your fall does not define your future." People reached out from across the country, some to donate, some to learn, many to simply say thank you. Jason remained humble through it all. He still lived modestly, still fixed phones with his team, and still walked Nathaniel to school hand in hand. One afternoon, during a foundation fundraiser, a young girl approached him shyly. "Mr. Jason," she whispered, "my brother has HIV too. We didn't think he'd ever get a job. But now he works at one of your shops." Jason knelt down, tears rising. "Tell him I'm proud of him," he said. "Tell him to never stop believing." That moment reminded him why he endured every hardship. His story was no longer just his, it was a lifeline for others. Jason stood before a crowd of thousands at an international summit in Nairobi. Dressed in a simple black suit with Amaka and Nathaniel in the front row, he took the stage not as a CEO's son, not as a fallen heir, but as a man who had reclaimed his life. His speech wasn't filled with business strategies or economic jargon. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. "I once thought HIV was the end of my story," he said. "But it was the beginning. It stripped away what didn't matter and showed me what did. It taught me that status means nothing without substance, that wealth means nothing without wisdom, and that love, real love, can resurrect the dead parts of our soul." The room erupted in applause. But Jason's eyes were only on two people, Amaka, his savior, and Nathaniel, his future. After the summit, the family returned home to quiet celebration. Richard joined them for dinner, a moment that felt full circle. The once divided family now sat around a simple table, sharing laughter and lessons. Jason caught his father watching Nathaniel with a softness in his eyes that had never been directed at him. It still stung sometimes, that he would never fully receive the love he once craved. But as he watched his son play, safe and loved, he realized something deeper. His father didn't have to redeem himself for Jason's sake. He only had to love Nathaniel, and that, Jason had learned, was enough. Some healing comes not by fixing the past, but by refusing to repeat it. And through Nathaniel, a new legacy was being written. Years later, when Jason looked back on his journey, he didn't focus on the fall, but on the climb. On the quiet strength of Amaka. On the miracle of Nathaniel. On the small but significant turn in his father's heart. He had turned disgrace into grace, pain into purpose, and scars into seeds. He often told his son, "I was born twice, once by blood and once by love." And he meant every word. Jason's life became a testament to redemption, not the kind handed down from mansions or boardrooms, but the kind earned through humility, resilience, and the fierce grace of a woman who loved him when he had nothing to give. And though Richard never said, "I'm sorry," he gave Jason something greater, a chance to end the cycle, a chance to start again. And in the eyes of his son, Jason found what his father never gave him: unconditional love. The truest inheritance of all. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tales by Tochi for more.